This is Marion McMurtry that we're talking to today. My name is Gaye LeBaron, and it is the 22nd of November in 1996. We're in the Sonoma County Museum. Marion, tell me where you were born, a little bit about your ancestors, your family.
I was born in San Francisco in 1927, and my dad had been fairly severely wounded in World War I, was working in the Bank of California in San Francisco, but he couldn't take the weather in San Francisco, he couldn't take the fog. So we came up to the ranch on the Russian River in 1927. I was about 3 months old when we moved up there. And off and on I lived there at the ranch until I went in the 4th grade. I started school at Ridenhour School. I lived with my grandparents mostly because my mother and dad moved to Middletown in Lake County. They ran the telephone office. They had the phone office up there. But my dad was ill a lot, and I guess having little kids around bothered him. But I spent most of my time at the ranch with my grandparents. And I guess I wasn't too easy to get along with either, because I was about 3 and a half when my grandmother packed me a lunch in a little snowdrift lard bucket and walked me over to the school one day and said, "Here she is, she's going to school." So, and my teacher was Catherine Ballard from the Ballard Ranch. From her husband was Bob Ballard from the Ballard Ranch. And it was a one-room school, Ridenhour School. It's up on the hill where the Hilton Fire Station is now. And there were 8 kids in the school when I went to school there. And I was the only one in the 1st and 2nd grade. So I did both grades at the same time. And then when I went back to Middletown in the 3rd grade, but I didn't stay very long. I came back to the ranch, and then my mother said that she wouldn't have me growing up in the Middletown Lake County schools, so we moved into Santa Rosa in the 4th grade. But I spent all of my time out on the river.
Now, this ranch was in your family. Talk about your maiden name was?
My maiden name was Ridenhour, and my great-grandfather was Louis Williams Ridenhour, and he came out here to California in 1849 to the gold fields in Marysville, around Marysville, and he was always one step behind the gold somehow. But he managed to make something anyway. And he sent back to Missouri, came out here from Missouri. He sent back, he was going to raise pigs, hogs. So he sent a partner, he had a young partner, and he sent him back to Missouri with the money to buy hogs, the stock. He was going to raise hogs, and I have a nasty suspicion that when he turned those hogs loose, that's probably the forerunners of all the ones that are rooting up everybody's vineyard all over the place. But anyway, the hog business didn't work out, and he raised cattle. He sent back also to Missouri for good cattle stock, because he noticed that what was left of the Spanish and Indian cattle around here was very scrawny and not very good. So he sent back for that, but he homesteaded, I guess is the word. He didn't want to go back to Missouri, so he went down the Sacramento River to San Francisco and then started up through he came up on the Petaluma River to Petaluma. He had his ox team, and he was looking for land that was not part of a land grant. His family had a bad situation with the Spanish government in Missouri before 1800, before it became the Louisiana Territory. They had land there from Spain. And his family had a bad time proving their ownership of the land, so he didn't want anything to do with land grants. So he came north until he found land that was no longer a land grant, and that was at the border of the El Molino Rancho, where it hit the Russian River. Beyond that was not owned. So he crossed the river, and I don't know, he took the land. How he got it, I don't know. He just said, he said, "This is mine." I don't know.
I think they treated it like homestead.
Like a homestead. Yeah. So in a homestead, you get just so many acres. Well, he got that, and then for a long, long time, he was the only white settler out there on the Russian River. And this was just just below Hacienda. This is where it was, just down the river from Hacienda. And then as people, the mountain men, and people started coming through when the fur trading went out. There were fur traders that just kept coming west. He paid them individually to homestead some more land, and then he bought it from them. And therefore he got somewhere around 14,000 acres he had all at one time. At one point he didn't keep that. But he went back down to, I don't know how he got mixed up, but anyway, he went back to San Francisco and he began hauling supplies up to this end of the valley. And he brought by ox team all the supplies that Harmon Heald used to start his trading post in Healdsburg. And at that time, Harmon, Samuel, and George, the brothers, two of the brothers went back to Missouri to bring some more of their family out here. And part of their family was a family that was related to them. They had come across the river from Illinois, and there were two little children, Mary and a little boy. And the parents died on the trail out here. So Harmon and George brought Mary Heald, and I don't know whether her name was Heald, but she ended up a Heald. Mary and her little brother on with them to Healdsburg, or up there to the trading post. And my great-grandfather was about in his early 30s when he married Mary Heald, and she was just to turn 14. But she wanted to learn to read and write. She'd never been to school, and so he took her by wagon down to San Jose to a convent and left her for 2 years, where she, under the sisters, learned to read and write. She must have learned a lot because she was a real smart lady by the time she got home. And then went back and got her and built the house that's out there now that a cousin of mine lives in now. And the back part of the house was built in 1853. And the back part and the main part of the house, there's no sawn lumbered in. He'd split all this lumber. And he made, most of his living, he made splitting rail fences. And the way it was told to me that most of the rail fences that are out, like the Laughlin Ranch and Slussers and all out along that part of the river, he split those rails and made those. And as his children grew, they had 11 children, not all of them lived, that the boys would help him. And another way they raised money was to, he had the Indians that came down to Guerneville, the Pomos, built him a dugout canoe. My Uncle Bob remembered it, and I remember seeing it in the barn, but it was gone then. It's certainly gone now. But it was so thin on the bottom that it would just skim across just wet sand even. It was a perfectly beautiful thing. And they sold fish up and down the river to ranchers. And my grandfather told me that he was 14 before he ever saw another white child other than his own brothers and sisters.
What was your grandfather's name?
My grandfather's name was Louis Edward, but everybody called him Abe because he was born during the years of the Civil War, and they called him Abe. And then he married Mary Dryden, whose father was an itinerant blacksmith, and he had a little blacksmith shop and a bellows and things up Hacienda Canyon. And they then settled down where the Ridenhour Ranch House Inn is, which I call the ranch now. But that's the house where I grew up. So it was a wonderful way to grow up out there on the river. I can remember when the train was still in there. That's one of my earliest memories. Is I was 5 when my parents brought me down one day from Middletown and put me on the train at Fulton to go out to the river, because they'd stop in front of the ranch house to let you off. They used to stop and pick my aunts and my dad up to go to school.
And the route of the train.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you. Your thumbs are hitting the microphone, so I can either move it or.
I'll put it down.
Sorry. And it's making a big pop.
The route of the train from Fulton went right straight out where River Road goes now, through Fulton and along by what used to be hop ranches, Busman's and all the rest of them out there. Then it went around the back side of the lagoon, and then on down the river. And there were lots of little stations. Most of those little roads, like Wolsey and Wolford, and all of those were all little train halts, more or less, along there. But it would stop just about any place. So, but then the last one I think ran in 1937. No, it ran in 35. They took the rails out in 37. I think that was it. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Santa Rosa High School, going to school there, and just what the town was like. And
When I went to Santa Rosa High School, I went into high school in September of 1939. I think there were 10,500 people in Santa Rosa at that time. City limits was Pacific Avenue and Humboldt, right there. I lived. My dad had bought a little farm on Edwards Avenue, and as nearly as I can figure out from the trees that they left there, our house was right where the post office is in Cottingtown, right there, right on it. And it was about 2 miles to school because I had to walk and then walk up Cleveland and around and one thing and another. But Santa Rosa High School was, I graduated from Lewis School in the 8th grade. That was a little country school. I didn't go to junior high because I was out of town. And when I went into Santa Rosa High School, I was 12. And I found it out in a hurry when I got there. But it was okay. It was good. I graduated in 1943, the biggest graduating class Santa Rosa High School ever had up until that time. That was wartime by then, and a lot of the kids had gone into the service instead of graduating. Jerry Posananovich from town, just lots of them. I went from Santa Rosa High School. I didn't go to JC. I went down to Berkeley. Went straight to Berkeley. And I really found out in a hurry I was from the country when I got there. I could have used a year at JC, I think. So,
and you must have worked in the crops.
I certainly did. When I was talking to Mr. Carrillo, you were taught Carrillo, about the prunes. Of course, if you grew up on the ranch, you picked the prunes. You picked the hops or the grapes or whatever else there was. But prune picking has to be the world's worst occupation. 2 cents a box. I remember we did get paid, but it was 2 cents or 4 cents a box. And then it was so awful, so dirty, and bees and flies. And
you don't pick them off the tree.
No, you pick them on the ground. It's just plain grub. That's all it is. And you break your fingernails, and it's awful. But then I can remember when I was about 9, they finally decided I was old enough to pick grapes. I could handle the grape boxes and the knife. Well, that was a real emancipation. You can fill a box of grapes. You got 10 cents a box for it. You know? So yes, I made school clothes money picking grapes.
How about hops?
I picked hops, but under duress. When I was in high school, my dad said that you have to learn how to pick hops because that's a lot of fun. We always had such fun when we were kids picking hops. So high school classes started at 8, and we were out there in the hop field at 6 in the morning because you had to pick them when they were wet because they don't weigh anything. And you have to fill these sacks that are 12 feet long or something like that. And if you don't pick them wet, they won't weigh anything. So that only lasted until I was sure that I could get away with saying, no, I'm not going anymore. So.
Please stop in my face.
Yeah. Give it 10 seconds and you'll be ready to start.
Well, my dad, as I said, was badly injured in World War I. He was, as a result, he was deaf in one ear and blind in one eye, although you couldn't see that. You know, it didn't show, but he was. But he was a very active member of the American Legion. And when we lived in Middletown, the Legion met 2 Wednesdays a month, and we would drive over the mountain, over St. Helena, to come down to Santa Rosa for the American Legion meeting. And that's basically how my family made all their friends. It lasted all their lives. And most of the what I could call class old friends of mine were from that same association. In those days, you knew just about everybody in town. And when we finally moved out of Middletown and came down to Santa Rosa, my dad worked for a real estate man here that he's no longer here in town. And then he went into the bank. He worked for one of the banks, and I don't really remember which bank it was. I think it was the American Trust Bank that isn't even here anymore. And we rented a house on Beaver Street when we first came down here, right across the street from the Ramseys, which were cousins. And through the bank, and those were Depression years, very severe Depression years, he was able to buy the little farm that we had out on Edwards Avenue. It was a foreclosure sale, and so we had 3 acres out there, which he paid, I don't know, $2,000 for or something like that, with an old house on it, but it was okay. But the house, the town was nice. I remember that my mother worked for Rosenberg's. First she worked for J.C. Penney's, and then she worked for Rosenberg's department store. And we had some friends named Carnegie's. That Mrs. Carnegie worked there too, and Dorothy was her daughter. And we would walk after school. Lots of times we would walk downtown to Rosenberg's. But let's see, Farmer's Drugstore was kitty corner across the thing, and the next door was Dibble's clothing store. I remember I got enough money once to buy a red, white, and blue striped jacket. Dibble's, I think it's the only thing I ever bought in there, but I loved it. I wore it until I wore it out. And Keegan's and the Wink and Lantern was across the street, and Bouck's was the place to go. I remember when I graduated from the 8th grade, my dad took me downtown. He said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "I want a banana split in Bouck's." So that's where we went. And then Oliver Ramsey bought the Wink and Lantern, and Oliver Ramsey was my dad's cousin. And during World War, this was after I met Jack, the first year I had met Jack, I made chocolate chip cookies to send. He was in officers training, or he was in the Navy anyway, down in New Orleans someplace. And I made chocolate chip cookies. Well, I like to cook about like Janice does, erase that. And so it was really a thing for me to make chocolate cookies. I chopped the nuts and I did all this stuff. I took them to school and I put them in my locker in this container, my gym locker. I think that was my mistake. Because after school when I got them, I was taking them downtown to mail them. The thing was just literally crawling with ants. It was just full of ants. They were exploding all over the place. All those cookies. I was just furious. So I took them down to the Wink and Lantern, and they let me go out in the alley. So I sat back there in that crummy alley on a big piece of newspaper and put all these cookies out there on the sheet and shook and picked and got all the ants out of them. At least I think I got all the ants out of them. And very carefully packed them all back up in this thing and shipped them off. And many years later, Jack told me by the time he got them, they were just crumbs. Just crumbs. I had all that work for nothing. That's probably the last time I made cookies. So, but it was...
Speaking of Jack, let's talk about how you met him and some of the years on the river when the big bands.
Well, we were just up the river from Rio Neto, and Jack remembers walking down the railroad track when he was a teenager. He's older than I am, 5 or 6 years older, so he does remember this. Walking down the railroad tracks to Rio Neto from Summer Home Park. His family had a summer home at Summer Home Park, and you would come across the little footbridge to Hilton and then walk down the tracks to Rio Neto. My grandmother was alive at that time, and she did not take kindly to people who walked along in the tracks in front of the house and would, he said, often set the dog on him. But I don't really know about that. So, but people on the river knew each other. Summer people began to know the river people that lived there, and as it turned out, Jack's Uncle Hartley knew my Aunt Leola, my dad's youngest sister, that lived there at the ranch. And they they got married. Jack's uncle married my aunt. Well, at that time I didn't know Jack. I had never met him. I was way too young. But that's how I met him, because on their daughter's second birthday, we all went across the river to Summer Home Park for a 4th of July party, because Judy's birthday was on the 2nd of July, and that's how I met Jack. And that was 1942, so we had our summer of 42. So, and the bands, Mr. Harris, I guess, when he had Rianito, brought in the first, this is not the Harris that's there now, it's his father, brought in the first bands, but I can remember Harry Owens down there, and Kay Kaiser. There was another one who I don't remember, but he was wonderful. He had plaid bandstand, fronts to this music stands, and about every 2 songs he would throw the baton up in the air and yell, "Scotch and soda time," and everybody would run madly to the bar. But they had a lovely outdoor sort of dance hall that they had at Rianito, which was the moon, yes. There used to be a moon hanging in the tree in the far end of Rianito. And it was always there to me. And Phil Harris said it was always there to him. He said it was there when his dad bought the park. So
Claire Harris.
Claire, yeah. So after Rianito folded and everything, it winked. It was this great big orange thing, and it would wink at you as you walked in the. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. I thought it was terrific. This great big thing up there.
It's always kind of a landmark.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
So about 3 or 4 years ago, we often wondered whatever happened to it, because the park just sort of fell apart after World War II, after that was over. So I went down and asked Claire Harris one day, I said, "Whatever happened to the moon?" And he said, "Oh, he says, I know who has that. And it's a guy named Glenn, and he lived up near Armstrong. So he gave me his phone number, but he says he's not very friendly." This is when you call him.
Except the dog, are you?
Well, no, I phoned him. He works for Hewlett Packard, and I called him and told him I was writing a story for the museum paper. And so I called him, I told him what I wanted, and he says, "Oh yeah," he says, "I've got it, you want it?" And I thought, yeah. But what would I do with it? I got a big tree in my front yard, but I don't think I'd like that moon up there. But he took it all apart. He just went up there and took it. And it's hollow. It's about 18 inches deep, and it's struts. It's built of struts. And the reason it was orange, his father painted the thing or built it or something. The reason it's orange was to match the bolts. They painted it orange to match the bolts that held it together. And the winking part was a series of light bulbs alternating, going on and off, is what gave you the winking kind of thing. He has it all crated and taken apart, and it's under his front porch up there. So, I always thought that would be a neat thing, on top of the museum or something here. Or on the Press Democrat. Somebody ought to have it.
Where memories linger.
When memories that lingered. There was a wrought iron sign that was over the, as you came down into Rianito, there was a pool once, like a reflecting pool or lily pond or something there. And there was this big iron thing, and memories that lingered. There's a little store in Guerneville that has that name, Memories That Linger. Now, a little clothing store. I don't know what the connection is, or if they just heard it or something. Yeah. But the bands were wonderful. Also at the Grove in Guerneville, and that was a neat place. It's too bad that burned. It had 4 Eastdale canoes up on end in the middle of it. Did you ever go there? No. It was an inside one. It was right next to Gory's Tavern, and when you went in, it had a balcony across one side. But it had these 4 beautiful canoes up in the middle with ferns or something around them. I don't remember that.
What's an Eastdale canoe as opposed to a regular Trowbridge canoe?
Well, Trowbridge canoes are aluminum and modern. Eastdale was a man that lived on the river, lived at Monterey, and then later down at Jenner. But he built canoes and rowboats, a certain kind. They're almost like an old town, which is the ultra kind of canoe that there is. But an old town is built for lakes and things in the East Coast. They used them in the lakes in Maine and not in the Great Lakes, but they got a lot of lakes back there. But Eastdale modified their wood and canvas canoes, and he modified this design more for the kind of rivers that we have out here, and he built them by hand. He had the they're not a mold, and they're not just a plan. I don't know what you'd call it. They're a form.
I call it a canoe mold.
What, a canoe mold? Yeah.
And dinghy molds. He made dinghies too.
Yes, he made. We have one.
rowboats.
We have a
Oh, do
dinghy.
you?
Yeah, here in the museum we have a canoe too, but it's not. Well, it's in pretty good
Yeah,
shape.
they were very good canoes.
They were excellent, but they were a modified design from an old town. And then when he died, I don't remember why this happened, but his sons destroyed the mold. Somebody wanted to buy them to continue making these things, and for some reason they said no, and destroyed them. So there are no more. But he was really pretty famous with his designs. Everybody that had a really good canoe on the river either had an old town or they had an Eastdale.
2 minutes, okay. I want you. I get the feeling that you were a woman of independent ways when you were young. Not that you're not still. You talked to me once about driving for the UN.
The Army,
The
yeah.
Army, that's right. What? How was that being? Did you have an attitude? Did you? Let's talk.
Do I have an attitude?
No, you know what I'm saying. You
I-
obviously were not in the mold of the average woman of the
Well,
1940s.
I don't think so. I graduated from high school when I was 16 in May, and I graduated from high school in June, and I left Santa Rosa that night.
Did your parents encourage this?
Well, my dad did, sort of. My mother didn't. She didn't think too much of that idea. But no, I left Santa Rosa the night I graduated from high school, and I didn't come back for 4 years to spend another night here. I stood up my date for the high school prom, believe it or not. That's not a thing to brag about. But
Do we want to say who that was? Or do we-
Thurlow Underhill. So, but I left, and I went to Washington, D.C. I had an uncle and aunt that lived there, and I took the train back there. And then I went down to Miami, and that was another story altogether. Jack was in the Navy back there then. And then I came back to San Francisco, and I got a job at the San Francisco Examiner. And I worked there while I was going to Cal. And then, I don't know, sudden burst of patriotism or something. I took a leave of absence from Cal and got a job driving staff cars for the Army. And
How
that,
old were you?
let's see, I guess I was 17 by then. So,
Yeah.
but I thoroughly enjoyed the war. That's a terrible thing to say. I had a great time driving the staff cars. It was a wonderful job. So it was plantation
The ranch.
road up there. So Jack and I went up there. Well, they'd left it out under the redwoods and uncovered and everything, and it just disintegrated. And then she said, Corbells were a thorn in our side. I think the first time I ever went through Corbell Winery was about 10 years ago. After, I don't think my dad ever did. It was just one of those things because the old man, Corbell, old Frank, I guess his name was, he was, well, I have all these papers at home, so I know this happened. Every 4 or 5 years, he'd move the grapevines over another 2 rows until he'd go just far enough that it would get my grandfather mad, and they'd hire another surveyor, and they would come out, and 3 times Corbell's paid the surveyor off, at least, until finally they got over to where they hit the road and they couldn't go any further. But they had about almost 3/4 of an acre of our land under their grapevines, you know. But all they ever did was just talk about it, you know. Nobody ever did anything about it until Hex bought Corbell's, and then they brought somebody in again to survey. And I remember that one of the Hex, I don't remember which one it was, came over to the ranch one day with a great big bottle of champagne and said, you know, look at what we found in these records, you know. And my Aunt Leola was laughing, and he said, now we can do several things here. We can rip up all these vines, which we really don't want to do, or we can give you a case of champagne every year, which my aunt says, but I don't want that. And so they just finally she said, it's enough just to have somebody finally admit this happened. So they let it go at that. But the little road that goes across the summer bridge at Oddfellows, it goes right in front of the ranch house, and it divides Corbell's in the Ridenhour property. And that little road got put there because in the early days, the tan oak gleaners were working on the hills south of, you know, on that side of the river. And they had to bring the tan oak bark across the river to the train. And we had a siding down just about in front of the orchard that's in front of my own property. It's my orchard now. And there was a long platform there. We put the milk cans out there, the cream cans, and the tan oak gleaners would come with their stuff there. Well, it was hard to get it across the river many times, so they came up and they asked my grandfather if they could build a road and a bridge across the river there in one of the shallow places. And he said, not there, but down here, right at the edge between the 2 pieces of property, I will give you the property to build the road. So that's how that little road got in there that goes up there.
Talk about tan oak a little bit, tan bark.
The only thing I really know about tan bark is that when they used to bring it to the tannery down here, it was the most unbelievable, awful smell you ever came across in your life. And they used to have it on playgrounds. I don't know, but by the time I remember anything, the tan oaks were gone off of our ranch. I think there's maybe 2 or 3 that are on the property now.
They're not really oaks, are
No, well, no, I don't think so. They don't, but it's just the bark, but then when you strip the bark off, of course, you kill the
Makes
tree.
tannic acid.
Yeah, it's tannic acid. They used to put it on playgrounds under the swings and things. But we don't have any. And I'm not sure that we ever did on our side of the river. The river's funny out there. There's things that'll grow on one side of the river that just don't grow on the other side of the river.
And tan bark, I mean, was quite an industry at one time. And
Tan bark was a big industry. That and they used some of that tan oak in the old charcoal burners down around Monterey when they would build the giant big kilns, that they used tan oak in there along with the madrone and things.
the charcoal is another lost industry to us.
Yes, yeah, they don't do that anymore. But I don't know. There's very few tan oak around now because I think they just, I mean, you kill the tree, you pull the bark off of it, and that's it. So, but that's another lost one. Corbell's, of course, everybody knows that they built cigar boxes when they first came there. But Tony Ruscia, Anton Ruscia, was a man from Bohemia that Corbell's brought over as not as a wine maker, but as he brought the vines over from Bohemia that started Corbell's industry, their wine thing out there. And Tony, his son, and my dad were contemporaries, and Tony's still alive. He lives in San Francisco. He's 101 now, and they came up. His kids brought him up to Corbell's about 5 or 6 years ago, and introduced him to Gary, and his father was the one that planted all the gardens, set out the gardens and everything. So
They grew tobacco there at one time.
they grew tobacco.
I guess other people in Greenville grew tobacco at one time.
Yeah, they did.
Essels.
Yeah, it didn't last very long though. That didn't last very long. Corbell's, there was always sort of bad feelings, as I said, between the Corbells and the Ridenhours. So we used to go through there. The kids, kids are okay; they can go any place. But we used to go up the little creek up there and get watercress under the little bridge up there. There was wonderful big things of watercress. But they brought in some interesting people that none of them live out there anymore. There were way up the canyon behind our ranch was a family called the Kreshaks, and then there was the Hashicks, and they all came from Bohemia and around that area where Corbells had come from. But my Uncle Bob always said, as bad as he was, the old man Corbell, you have to say one thing for him. He said when these people would hear about them and they would come across the Atlantic and try to get out here to California, they would go to a great deal of hardship to get out here. He always took care of them, whether he had a job for him or not. He always supported them and took care of them and sent them on to a job. He said,
So it was kind of like a little immigrant community.
Community, right. So, and then they grew, they had prunes also down there. The big field that is the first one, it's all one big vineyard now, but by the little summer bridge, from there down to the front of the winery was all prunes at one time. So they diversified in there too. And then I think they ran into trouble somewhere along the line because they advertised so many acres of champagne grapes, and then somebody checked up once and they didn't have that many, so they were forced to tear the orchard out and put the grapes in there.
Well, now, with your grandfather at one time being the only white settler on the river.
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. And your great-grandmother being a heel, you must feel that that's kind of your river there from...
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, get off my river.
And how do you feel about the way things go down there now?
Oh, I've kind of gotten used to them. It bothers me, I'm a great believer in no trespassing signs. I always honor them when I see them someplace because it's just awful to go down there and find everybody's garbage all over your property. And we would put up signs and they'd be gone the next day. The deputy sheriff used to come up from Guerneville and watch us. He'd park on the bridge and watch us put up the sign. He says, "This is proof that you did it. I'm here seeing you do it." Because we were so afraid of somebody getting hurt, or the canoers come down and then go up in the brush or light a fire or do something. And Trowbridge is not my favorite industry. So, but he isn't the only one. There's a lot of people that do that. So, but I don't know. A long time ago, it was really nice on the river. Even when my kids were growing up, they could go all day on the river and not run into any trouble. We had when your mother and Janice were growing up out there too. They were 10, 12 years old. We had a collie, a great big collie dog, and we had a surfboard that Jack had built when he was a teenager to use in the surf off of the cliff house, and it was a wooden one, not like the ones you see today. It was about this thick, and it was 10 feet long or 12 feet long or something. The girls would take the dog down, and the dog would ride on the surfboard, and they would push this thing and swim all the way up to Summer Home Park and down to Guerneville, that far. Then they went everywhere. And you could hear the dog bark, and when the dog was barking, I knew the kids were in the river. If the dog wasn't barking, they were out of the river. Well, you can't even hear things like that anymore. That reminds me, I'll tell you one story that I tell Chris when he was little. My grandfather used to tell me that his father, that would be my great-grandfather, when he first came there, there was nobody around anywhere. And it was so quiet that when he first established his little shed, he built a little shack. He lived in his covered wagon at first, his ox wagon. But he could always, once in a while, he could hear this roar that he was sure was a waterfall. So when he had the time and he had a way of getting there, he started down the river walking to find this waterfall, which he couldn't believe existed because in the summertime especially, there wasn't hardly any water in the river. It was just pools. It was long before Van Arsdale. And this was in March. And he followed the river down, and he could hear it, but he could never came across anything that was like a waterfall. And what it finally turned out to be was a storm on the coast, and what he heard was the waves and the sand and the rocks. It was just that quiet, and the sound would carry that well. Can you imagine that? Just not for a minute. I contrast that with the time when I was about 12, sitting on the front porch with my grandfather at the ranch, and the road was in. They'd taken the highway, the railroad tracks out, and the highway was in. And I can remember sitting out there with him on the 4th of July, and he would just shake his head. He said, I don't know what this place is coming to. He says, I've been out here only an hour, and there's been 25 cars past here.
Thank you. That's just perfect. Just perfect. Thanks.
Now,